The sun beat down mercilessly as Abigail Turner staggered forward, her parched lips cracked and bleeding, the cruel words of her husband still ringing in her ears. "You're nothing but dead weight, Abby. I won't die out here because of you." 3 days had passed since Richard had taken their wagon, their supplies, and their dreams, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a canteen that had run dry before sunset on the first day. The year was 1869, and the Oregon Trail had claimed many victims, but Abigail had never imagined she would be abandoned rather than buried along its harsh path. At 22, she had married Richard, believing his promises of a new life in Oregon's lush valleys. Now, as she stumbled through the Wyoming Territory with no shelter and no hope, those dreams seemed as distant as the horizon itself. Her vision blurred as she crested yet another hill. The vast emptiness of the landscape seemed to mock her desperation. Abigail's legs finally gave out, and she collapsed onto the hard-packed earth, the dust coating her once fine blue dress that had been her pride back in Ohio. The world tilted and spun as consciousness began to slip away from her grasp. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats penetrated the fog in her mind, but she couldn't tell if they were real or a hallucination born of desperate hope. A shadow fell across her face, blocking the merciless sun. Through swollen eyelids, she made out the silhouette of a man on horseback. "Madam? Madam, can you hear me?" The voice was deep and tinged with concern. Abigail tried to respond, but her throat was too dry, her lips too cracked. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was a pair of intense eyes beneath the brim of a worn leather hat. When consciousness returned, Abigail found herself lying on something soft, a damp cloth cooling her forehead. She blinked, trying to focus on her surroundings. Rough-hewn wooden walls surrounded her, and a lantern cast soft golden light across the small room. "You're awake." The same deep voice from earlier drew her attention to a man sitting in a chair beside the bed. "Thought I might lose you there for a bit." He was tall, even seated, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years under the open sky. His dark hair was in need of a trim, falling almost to his shoulders, and a short beard covered his jaw. But it was his eyes that held her attention, keen and alert, yet somehow gentle. "Water," she managed to croak. He reached for a cup on the nearby table and carefully helped her sit up enough to drink. The cool liquid was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. "Slow now," he cautioned. "Too much at once will make you sick." After a few careful sips, Abigail found her voice. "Who are you?" "Name's Xavier Reed. This is my cabin." He set the cup down. "Found you about half dead on the trail. Want to tell me how a lady like yourself ended up alone in the middle of nowhere?" Abigail's eyes filled with tears as the memories flooded back. "My husband. He left me. We were on our way to Oregon. The journey was taking longer than expected, and our supplies were running low," he said. Her voice broke. "He said I was slowing him down, that I'd get us both killed. So he took everything and left me behind 3 days ago." Xavier's expression darkened. "What's your name, madam?" "Abigail. Abigail Turner." "Well, Mrs. Turner, your husband sounds like the kind of man who deserves a special kind of justice." He stood up, his tall frame nearly touching the low ceiling. "But right now you need rest and food. I've got some stew on the stove. Think you can manage a few bites?" Abigail nodded, suddenly aware of the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. While Xavier moved to the small iron stove in the corner of the cabin, she took stock of her situation. Her dress had been replaced by a man's shirt that swallowed her frame. The realization that he must have undressed her sent heat rushing to her cheeks. "I hope you don't mind the change of clothes," Xavier said, as if reading her thoughts. "Your dress was caked with dirt, and you were burning up with fever. I did what was necessary, nothing more." He returned with a bowl of stew. "I've been living alone so long I sometimes forget proper manners, but I assure you, I'm not the kind of man who'd take advantage." Thank you, Abigail whispered, accepting the bowl with shaking hands. For saving my life. Any decent man would have done the same. The stew was simple chunks of rabbit with wild onions and a few potatoes, but to Abigail, it tasted better than any fine meal she'd had back east. As strength slowly returned to her limbs, she took in more details about her rescuer. His clothes were worn but clean, his movements efficient and purposeful. A gun belt hung on a peg by the door, the holster holding what looked like a well-maintained Colt revolver. "Are you a rancher?" she asked between careful spoonfuls. Xavier's mouth quirked up at one corner. "Of sorts. Got a small spread about a mile from here. Nothing fancy, few dozen head of cattle, couple of horses, some chickens. This cabin's just a line shack I use when I'm working this section of my land." He leaned back in his chair. "Been on my own since the war ended. Came out west to start fresh." "The war?" Abigail set down her spoon, her curiosity piqued. A shadow passed over Xavier's face. "Fought for the Union. Saw things no man should have to see." He cleared his throat. "But that's ancient history now." Abigail sensed there was more to his story, but she didn't press. She'd only just met this man, and despite his kindness, she knew nothing about him. "How far are we from the nearest town?" she asked instead. "Silver Creek's about 20 miles south. It's small, but they've got a general store, a saloon, even a doctor who's sober most days." Xavier studied her face. "I can take you there once you're strong enough to travel, if that's what you want." The question hung in the air between them. What did she want? Abigail had no money, no belongings, no family waiting for her anywhere. The future stretched before her, vast and uncertain as the prairie itself. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I don't have anywhere to go." Xavier nodded, as if her answer was expected. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until you figure things out. I've got plenty of room at the main house, and could use some help with the cooking and such if you're willing." He stood up. "But that's a decision for tomorrow. Right now, you need sleep." As he moved to leave, Abigail caught his sleeve. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "Xavier," he corrected. "And there's no debt between us, Abigail. Get some rest now." When he had gone, closing the door softly behind him, Abigail sank back onto the pillow. For the first time in days, she felt safe. As sleep claimed her once more, she wondered what kind of man Xavier Reed truly was, and what fate had in store for her now that her life had been so unexpectedly preserved. The next morning, Abigail woke to sunlight streaming through a small window. Her body ached, but the terrible weakness and thirst had subsided. She sat up carefully, noting that Xavier had left a bucket of clean water, a bar of soap, and a towel on the table beside the bed. Next to these was a neatly folded dress, simple but clean, and a pair of worn leather boots that looked like they might be close to her size. Gratitude welled up inside her as she washed as best she could and changed into the offered clothing. The dress was plain calico, patched in places but serviceable, and only a little loose on her frame. The boots were scuffed but comfortable enough when she laced them tightly. Feeling human again, she ventured outside. The cabin stood in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, with mountains rising in the distance. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed earth. A small corral stood empty nearby, suggesting Xavier had already taken his horse and gone about his day's work. The sound of chopping drew her attention to the side of the cabin, where she found Xavier splitting logs with powerful, methodical swings of an axe. He worked shirtless, his skin glistening with sweat, muscles rippling with each movement. Abigail felt her cheeks grow warm as she watched him, suddenly aware that she was staring. As if sensing her presence, Xavier paused and turned. His face broke into a smile when he saw her standing there. "Morning," he called, setting down his axe and reaching for the shirt hanging on a nearby branch. "You're looking better today." "I feel better," Abigail replied, averting her eyes as he pulled on his shirt. "Thank you for the clothes." "They belong to my sister," Xavier explained, buttoning his shirt as he walked toward her. "She visited last year, left some things behind. Figured they'd fit you better than anything I have." "You have family nearby?" Abigail asked, surprised. Xavier shook his head. "Sarah lives back east with her husband and children. Philadelphia. They came out to see the wild frontier, as she called it." His expression softened at the memory. "She thought I was crazy to live out here all alone." "Why do you?" The question slipped out before Abigail could stop herself. "Live alone, I mean." Xavier's smile faded slightly. "After the war, being around too many people didn't sit right with me. Out here, a man can breathe, can think clearly." He gestured toward the mountains. "No one telling you who to be or how to live." Abigail nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. Her own marriage had been a series of commands and criticisms, Richard molding her into what he wanted rather than accepting who she was. "Hungry?" Xavier asked, changing the subject. "I've got coffee on and some biscuits left from breakfast." They walked together to the main house, which proved to be a sturdy log structure about a quarter-mile from the line shack. It was simple but well-built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Inside, the main room combined kitchen and living areas, with two doors leading to what Abigail presumed were bedrooms. "It's not much," Xavier said, pouring her a cup of strong black coffee, "but it keeps the rain off and the warmth in." "It's wonderful," Abigail replied honestly. After days of thinking she would die alone under the open sky, walls and a roof seemed like luxury beyond measure. Xavier showed her around the property as the day progressed. His small spread turned out to be nearly 200 acres, with good grazing land and a creek running through it. The cattle closer to 60 head than the few dozen he'd mentioned looked healthy and well-tended. Besides the main house and line shack, there was a barn, a chicken coop, and a small vegetable garden that showed signs of neglect. "Haven't had much time for that," Xavier admitted when Abigail commented on the garden. "Cattle and fences keep me busy enough." "I could help with it," she offered. "I've always had a way with growing things." Xavier looked pleased. "I'd appreciate that. Be nice to have fresh vegetables again." As they walked back toward the house, Abigail's legs began to tremble, her body reminding her that she was still recovering from her ordeal. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Xavier said, noticing her fatigue. Without warning, he scooped her into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing. "Mr. Reed," Abigail gasped, automatically throwing her arms around his neck to steady herself. "This isn't necessary." "Xavier," he reminded her, his voice rumbling close to her ear. "And you're about to collapse. Saving you once was work enough. I'd rather not have to do it again so soon." Despite her protests, he carried her all the way back to the house and set her gently in a chair by the fireplace. The brief contact left Abigail flustered and confused. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with such care. Richard's hands had grown increasingly rough over their 2 years of marriage, his initial tenderness giving way to impatience and, in the final months, outright cruelty. "Rest," Xavier instructed, putting a blanket over her legs. "I need to check on something in the north pasture. I'll be back before sundown." After he'd gone, Abigail looked around the house more carefully. Despite being a bachelor's home, it was surprisingly orderly. Few personal touches adorned the walls or shelves, but a small bookcase held a dozen or so well-worn volumes, mostly practical manuals on ranching and veterinary care, but also a few novels and a Bible. On the mantelpiece stood a single photograph in a simple wooden frame. Curious, Abigail rose and picked it up. It showed a younger Xavier in a Union Army uniform, standing beside another soldier. Both men were smiling, their arms around each other's shoulders, looking impossibly young and untouched by the horrors that would follow. "That's James," Xavier's voice said from the doorway, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the photograph. "I'm sorry," Abigail said quickly, returning it to the mantelpiece. "I didn't mean to pry." Xavier moved to stand beside her, looking at the image with an expression she couldn't quite read. "No harm in looking. James Cooper. Best friend I ever had. We enlisted together, fought side by side for 3 years." His voice grew softer. "He died at Petersburg, just months before the war ended. Took a Confederate bullet meant for me." "I'm so sorry," Abigail whispered, understanding now some of the shadows she'd seen in Xavier's eyes. "He made me promise to live a good life for both of us," Xavier continued, still gazing at the photograph. "Some days I wonder if I've kept that promise." He shook himself, as if casting off the weight of memory. "Anyway, that's why I came out here. James always talked about seeing the West. So, I'm seeing it for him." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity or drama, touched something deep in Abigail's heart. This man carried his burdens quietly, yet he'd stopped to help a stranger dying on the trail. In that moment, she knew with certainty that whatever path had led her here, to this place and this man, it was no mere chance. "I think he would be proud of the life you've built," she said softly. Xavier turned to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. Then, slowly, a genuine smile spread across his face. "Thank you for that, Abigail. Truly." That evening, they sat together at Xavier's rough-hewn table, sharing a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread. Abigail had insisted on helping prepare the food, despite Xavier's protests that she should continue resting. "I can't sit idle while you do everything," she'd told him firmly. "I may be recovering, but I'm not helpless." Now, watching him eat the meal she'd helped create, Abigail felt a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was a start toward repaying his kindness. "This is the best meal I've had in months," Xavier said, reaching for another piece of cornbread. "You've got a talent in the kitchen, Abigail." "My mother taught me," she replied, pleased by the compliment. "She always said a good meal was medicine for both body and spirit." "Wise woman," Xavier nodded. "Where is she now, your mother?" Abigail's smile faded. "She passed away 5 years ago. Influenza took both my parents within a week of each other." "I'm sorry to hear that," Xavier said quietly. "No siblings?" "An older brother, Thomas. He went to California during the gold rush in '52. We exchange letters once or twice a year, but I haven't seen him since I was 15. She hesitated, then added, "After our parents died, I lived with my aunt in Cincinnati until I met Richard." Xavier's expression darkened at the mention of her husband. "How long were you married?" 2 years, Abigail replied. "We wed in '67. Richard owned a dry goods store in Ohio, but he always talked about the opportunities out west. When he sold the store to finance our journey to Oregon, I thought." She paused, the memory still raw. "I thought we were building a future together." "Some men don't deserve the women they marry," Xavier said, his voice hard. "Leaving you to die like that, there's no excuse for such cowardice." "I keep wondering what I could have done differently," Abigail admitted. "If I'd been stronger, complained less about the hardships." "Stop right there," Xavier interrupted, reaching across the table to touch her hand briefly. "No one deserves to be abandoned like that. Not you, not anyone. The fault lies with him, not you." His fierce defense brought unexpected tears to Abigail's eyes. She blinked them back, unwilling to seem weak in front of this man who had already seen her at her most vulnerable. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Xavier cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I've made up the spare room for you," he said, changing the subject. "It's small, but the bed's comfortable enough. You should be able to sleep better than you did in that line shack." That night, lying in the narrow bed in Xavier's spare room, Abigail stared at the ceiling and pondered her situation. She had no money, no possessions beyond the borrowed clothes on her back, and no real plan for the future. By all logic, she should feel terrified and lost. Yet somehow, in this stranger's home, she felt safer than she had in years. Xavier Reed was unlike any man she had ever known, strong yet gentle, capable yet kind. The way he looked at her made her feel seen in a way Richard never had, even in the early days of their courtship.
But what was she to him?
A responsibility? A burden he'd picked up out of decency? And how long could she reasonably stay before wearing out her welcome? These questions chased each other through her mind as she drifted into an uneasy sleep. In the days that followed, Abigail gradually regained her strength. She took over the cooking and began to restore the neglected garden, finding satisfaction in the simple act of bringing order to the tangled rows of vegetables. Xavier seemed genuinely appreciative of her efforts, and they fell into an easy rhythm of shared meals and evening conversations. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, Abigail was weeding the garden when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Xavier riding in, leading a second horse, a gentle-looking chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face. "Thought you might like to learn to ride," Xavier called as he dismounted. "This is Daisy. She's got a sweet temperament, perfect for a beginner." Abigail approached cautiously, having had little experience with horses beyond the draft animals that had pulled their wagon. "She's beautiful," she said, reaching out to stroke the mare's velvety nose. "Every person in this country should know how to ride," Xavier said, adjusting the saddle. "Especially out here. Never know when you might need to get somewhere in a hurry." For the next hour, he patiently taught her the basics: how to mount, how to hold the reins, how to signal the horse to walk, stop, and turn. Abigail was a quick study, and by the end of the lesson, she was trotting in circles around the corral, laughing with the sheer joy of it. "You're a natural," Xavier called, watching her from the fence. His smile made something flutter in Abigail's chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time. "It's exhilarating," she replied as she brought Daisy to a stop beside him. "Thank you for teaching me." "We'll go for a proper ride tomorrow if you're up for it," Xavier suggested. "There's a spot by the creek I'd like to show you." The next day dawned clear and bright. After breakfast, Xavier saddled both horses, and they set out across the rolling grassland. Abigail was still a bit sore from her first riding lesson, but the discomfort faded as they rode side by side, Xavier pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about his first years on the ranch. "When I first came here in '65, there was nothing but an old trapper's cabin falling to pieces," he told her. "Took me 2 years to build the house and get the first herd established." "You did all that alone?" Abigail asked, impressed.
Xavier nodded.
"Had some help from the Wilsons. They've got the next spread over about 10 miles east.
Good people.
Harvey Wilson taught me most of what I know about cattle." "Don't you get lonely?" The question slipped out before Abigail could stop it. Xavier was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. "Used to think the solitude was what I wanted. After the war, the noise of crowds, the press of people, it was too much. Out here, I could breathe again." He glanced at her. "But lately, I've been wondering if maybe I've had enough solitude to last a lifetime." Something in his tone made Abigail's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, Xavier pointed ahead to where the land dipped toward a line of cottonwood trees. "There's the creek," he said. "And that's where we're headed." The spot Xavier wanted to show her turned out to be a small, natural pool formed where the creek widened and deepened before continuing its journey. Willows dipped their branches into the clear water, and wildflowers dotted the grassy bank. "It's beautiful," Abigail breathed, dismounting carefully as Xavier had taught her. "Found it my first summer here," Xavier said, tying the horses in the shade. "Come here sometimes to think, or just to enjoy the quiet." They sat together on the bank, a comfortable silence between them as they watched the water ripple and swirl. Abigail found herself stealing glances at Xavier's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the sunlight caught in his dark hair. "Tell me about your dreams," Xavier said suddenly. "Before everything happened, what were you hoping to find in Oregon?" Abigail considered the question, realizing no one had asked about her dreams in a very long time. "I wanted land of my own," she said finally. "A place where things could grow. Richard talked about starting another store, but I always imagined a farm. Fruit trees, maybe. A garden big enough to feed a family, with extra to preserve for winter." She smiled ruefully. "Silly dreams, maybe." "Not silly at all," Xavier replied. "Dreams are what keep us going, especially out here." He picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the pool. "When I first staked my claim, people said I was crazy. Too much land for one man to handle, they said. Maybe they were right. I think you've done remarkably well," Abigail said honestly. Xavier turned to look at her directly, his expression serious. "Abigail, I've been meaning to talk to you about your situation." Her heart sank. Here it came, the gentle suggestion that it was time for her to move on, to stop imposing on his hospitality. "I know I should be making plans to leave," she said quickly. "Perhaps in Silver Creek I could find work as a leave." Xavier interrupted, looking genuinely surprised. "That's not what I was going to say at all." He took a deep breath. "Actually, I was wondering if you'd consider staying permanently." Abigail stared at him, not sure she'd heard correctly. "Staying? But why would you want?" "Because in just 1 week, you've brought more life to that place than it's seen in years," Xavier said earnestly. "The house feels like a home with you in it. And he hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I enjoy your company, Abigail. More than I've enjoyed anyone's company in a long time." "Oh," Abigail whispered, her mind racing to catch up with this unexpected turn. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," Xavier assured her. "And I'm not asking for, well, I'm not presuming anything. Just offering you a place where you're welcome for as long as you want it." The sincerity in his eyes moved her deeply. Here was a man offering her sanctuary with no expectations, no demands, the opposite of everything she had come to expect from her interactions with men. "Thank you," she said softly. "I would like to stay, at least for now." Xavier's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." As they rode back to the ranch that afternoon, Abigail felt a new lightness in her heart. For the first time since Richard had abandoned her, she could see a future stretching out before her, not the one she had planned, but perhaps one even better. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Abigail settled into life at the Reed Ranch. The garden flourished under her care, yielding fresh vegetables for their table. She learned to milk the cow Xavier kept for butter and cheese, to collect eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, and to ride Daisy with increasing confidence. Xavier taught her other skills as well: how to identify which plants were edible in the wild, how to judge weather patterns by watching the sky, how to shoot the rifle he kept above the fireplace. This last lesson had come after a discussion about the potential dangers of frontier life. "I hope you never need to use it," Xavier had said, showing her how to load and aim the Winchester. "But I'd sleep better knowing you could protect yourself if necessary." They rode into Silver Creek one Saturday so Abigail could purchase some essentials. Xavier had insisted on giving her money, brushing aside her protests. "Consider it payment for all the cooking and gardening," he'd said. "Besides, I've had no one to spend my cattle money on for years. Let me do this." Silver Creek proved to be exactly as Xavier had described it: small but thriving, with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other businesses lining its single main street. As they tied their horses outside the store, Abigail noticed several women giving her curious looks. "Word travels fast in small towns," Xavier murmured, noticing her discomfort. "They're just wondering who you are." Inside the store, they were greeted by a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and a friendly smile. "Xavier Reed. Haven't seen you in town for an age." And who might this lovely lady be? Abigail Turner, Xavier replied, his tone neutral but firm. Mrs. Turner is staying at my ranch for a while. The storekeeper's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Turner. I'm Howard Perkins. Anything you need, you just let me know. As they browsed the store's offerings, selecting fabric for new clothes, soap, and other necessities, Abigail became aware of a woman approaching them. She was perhaps in her 40s, well-dressed, and carrying herself with obvious confidence. Xavier Reed, you've been keeping secrets, the woman said, her tone gently teasing. Aren't you going to introduce me to your friend? Xavier turned, his expression softening. Abigail, this is Mrs. Emma Wilson. Her husband Harvey is the rancher I mentioned, the one who helped me get started. Emma, this is Abigail Turner. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Wilson, Abigail said, extending her hand. Emma Wilson took it warmly. Likewise, my dear. And please call me Emma. We don't stand on ceremony much out here. She glanced at Xavier. I'd love to hear how you two met. Xavier hesitated, clearly unsure how much of Abigail's story to share in such a public setting. Abigail decided to take the lead. Xavier found me in a difficult situation on the trail, she said simply. He very kindly offered me shelter while I decide what's next for me. Understanding flashed in Emma's eyes. I see, she said. Well, I'm glad he found you then. Xavier's place could use a woman's touch, if you don't mind my saying so. Emma, Xavier warned, but there was no real annoyance in his tone. Oh, don't look so scandalized, Emma laughed. I'm just stating facts. She turned back to Abigail. You must come to dinner at our ranch soon. Both of you. It would do Harvey good to see that Xavier hasn't become a complete hermit. After promising to visit the Wilson Ranch soon, they completed their purchases and headed back to Xavier's place. On the ride home, Abigail found herself mulling over Emma's words and the assumptions that seemed to underlie them. Do people think I'm living with you improperly? She asked Xavier directly. Xavier looked uncomfortable. People will think what they want to think. Emma knows better. She's just a romantic at heart, always trying to match people up. It doesn't bother you? What people might say? Xavier shrugged. I've never much cared for other people's opinions of my life. But if it bothers you, we could. He trailed off, then cleared his throat. That is, there are solutions if you're concerned about your reputation. Abigail felt her cheeks grow warm as she realized what he was suggesting. Are you proposing marriage, Mr. Reed? She asked, trying to keep her tone light despite the sudden racing of her heart. No. I mean, not like this, not now. Xavier looked flustered, a state Abigail had never seen him in before. I wouldn't insult you with a proposal made out of convenience. If when I ask a woman to marry me, it will be because I want her as my wife, not because I'm worried about wagging tongues in town. The vehemence of his response both relieved and disappointed Abigail, though she wasn't quite ready to examine why. I appreciate your honesty, she said quietly. And I'm not concerned about gossip. You've been nothing but honorable, and I know the truth of our arrangement. Xavier nodded, though something in his expression suggested the conversation had left him troubled. They rode the rest of the way in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. That evening, as Abigail prepared dinner, she found herself watching Xavier more closely than usual. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, his presence in the kitchen beside her both comforting and somehow thrilling. When their hands brushed as he reached for a plate, the brief contact sent a shock through her that she couldn't easily dismiss. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. She was developing feelings for Xavier Reed that went far beyond gratitude. But did he feel the same? His offer to let her stay had been made out of kindness, not romantic interest. And after her disastrous marriage, was she even capable of recognizing true affection when she saw it? 2 months after Abigail's arrival at the Reed Ranch, a letter arrived from Silver Creek. It was addressed to Mrs. Abigail Turner, care of Xavier Reed. Who even knows I'm here? Abigail wondered aloud as Xavier handed her the envelope. Word travels, Xavier replied, especially when Howard Perkins's wife is involved. She's the unofficial postmistress of Silver Creek gossip. Abigail broke the seal and unfolded the letter. As she read, her face paled. What is it? Xavier asked, concern evident in his voice. Bad news. It's for my brother Thomas, Abigail said, her hands trembling slightly. Someone from the wagon train must have reached Oregon and spread word about what Richard did. Thomas heard about it and has been trying to find me. She looked up at Xavier, her eyes wide. He's coming here. He says he's in Denver now and should arrive in Silver Creek within 2 weeks. Xavier's expression was carefully neutral. That's good news, isn't it? Family coming to help you. Yes, of course, Abigail replied automatically, though her heart was racing with unexpected anxiety. It's just unexpected. The truth was more complicated than she could express. Part of her was overjoyed at the prospect of reuniting with her brother after so many years. But another part, a part she was only now acknowledging, feared what his arrival might mean for her newfound life with Xavier. Would Thomas insist she return east with him? Would Xavier expect her to go? The thought of leaving the ranch, of leaving Xavier, caused an ache in her chest that she couldn't ignore. Well, we'll make him welcome when he arrives, Xavier said, his tone deliberately casual. The spare room will need fresh linens. Abigail nodded, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into her pocket. Yes, of course. Thank you. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo. Outwardly, life at the ranch continued as before, but there was a new tension between Abigail and Xavier, an awareness that change was coming whether they were ready for it or not. They rode into Silver Creek on the day Thomas's stagecoach was scheduled to arrive. Abigail found herself scanning the faces of every man who passed, wondering if she would even recognize her brother after all these years. The stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust, the driver calling out a greeting to the gathered townspeople as he reined in the team. Passengers began to disembark, a well-dressed couple, a traveling salesman, and finally, a tall man with familiar eyes that widened in recognition when they landed on Abigail. Abby, he called, his voice deeper than she remembered, but unmistakably Thomas. Thomas. Abigail rushed forward, and then she was enveloped in her brother's embrace, tears streaming down her face as years of separation melted away. Thank God, Thomas murmured, holding her at arm's length to look at her. When I heard what that bastard did to you, I feared the worst. I'm all right, Abigail assured him. Thanks to Xavier. She turned to introduce the two men, suddenly aware of how different they were. Thomas was dressed in the fashion of a successful businessman, his suit hardly creased despite the long journey. Beside him, Xavier looked every inch the frontier rancher in his practical clothing and worn hat. Mr. Reed, Thomas said, extending his hand. I understand I owe you a debt I can never repay. You saved my sister's life. Xavier shook Thomas's hand firmly. No debt necessary, Mr. Turner. Your sister has more than earned her keep at the ranch. Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly at this, but he nodded. Still, I insist on compensating you for your trouble. Perhaps we could discuss terms over dinner? I've been told the hotel here serves a decent meal. Before Xavier could respond, Abigail interjected. Actually, Thomas, I was hoping you might come back to the ranch with us. It's where I've been living these past months, and I'd like to show you. Thomas looked surprised, but agreed readily enough. Of course, Abby. I want to hear everything that's happened since. Well, since your ordeal began. The ride back to the ranch was filled with Thomas's questions and Abigail's carefully edited responses. She found herself downplaying the severity of her abandonment, unwilling to feel Thomas's obvious anger toward Richard. Xavier rode slightly ahead, giving the siblings space to reconnect, but Abigail was acutely aware of his silent presence. At the ranch, Thomas made a visible effort to hide his surprise at the modest accommodations. As a successful businessman in California, he had clearly grown accustomed to more luxurious surroundings. But he praised the property sincerely enough, especially the garden that Abigail had brought back to life. "You always have a gift with growing things," he said, examining the neat rows of vegetables. "Remember that window box you kept at Aunt Gertrude's? Even in the middle of Cincinnati, you managed to grow the sweetest tomatoes I've ever tasted." Abigail smiled at the memory. "I'd forgotten about that. Aunt Gertrude thought it was a waste of time." "She was wrong about a lot of things," Thomas said, his expression softening, "including pushing you toward Richard Turner." He glanced toward the house, where Xavier was preparing coffee. "Abby, we need to talk about your situation." "My situation is perfectly fine," Abigail replied, perhaps too quickly. "Xavier has been nothing but kind and respectful." "I'm sure he has," Thomas said carefully. "But surely you can't intend to stay here indefinitely? A single woman living in a bachelor's home, no matter how honorable his intentions." "It's not appropriate, Abby." Abigail felt a flash of irritation. "I'm a grown woman, Thomas. And a married one, technically, since Richard is still alive somewhere." "About that," Thomas said, lowering his voice, "I've spoken to a lawyer in San Francisco. Given the circumstances of your abandonment, there are grounds for divorce. Richard Turner forfeited any claim to you when he left you to die." The news should have been welcome. Freedom from her legal ties to Richard was something Abigail hadn't dared hope for. But Thomas's next words doused her momentary elation. "Once the divorce is finalized, you can come live with me and Clara in San Francisco. We have plenty of room, and Clara would love the company. You could have a fresh start, Abby, a proper life in civilization, not." He gestured vaguely at the ranch around them. "Not this," Abigail finished for him, her voice tight. "Not a life I've chosen for myself, where I'm valued and respected." Thomas looked taken aback by her vehemence. "I didn't mean to offend you. I just want what's best for you. And you assume you know what that is better than I do?" Abigail took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "Thomas, I appreciate your concern. Truly. But I'm not the same girl who left Cincinnati. I've changed." "Clearly," Thomas murmured, studying her face. "Abby, are you in love with this rancher?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. Was she in love with Xavier? The feeling that had been growing inside her these past months, was that what it was? Not gratitude or friendship or the simple comfort of safety, but love? "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Maybe. But it doesn't matter. Xavier has never indicated he sees me as anything more than a friend in need." Thomas's expression softened. "Oh, Abby, if you could see the way he looks at you when you're not watching. I think Mr. Reed's feelings might run deeper than you realize." Hope flickered in Abigail's chest, but she tamped it down. "Even if that were true, it doesn't change the fact that I'm still legally married. And Xavier is too honorable to pursue a married woman." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps the sooner we resolve your legal situation, the better. For everyone involved." That evening, Thomas insisted on sleeping in the barn despite Xavier's offer of the spare room. "I'll be more comfortable there," he said firmly. "And it's more appropriate under the circumstances." After Thomas had gone, Abigail found Xavier sitting on the porch, staring out at the darkening sky. She joined him, the wooden steps creaking slightly beneath her weight. "Your brother seems like a good man," Xavier said after a moment. "He cares about you a great deal." "He does," Abigail agreed. "Though he has some rather fixed ideas about what's best for me." Xavier turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "And what do you think is best for you, Abigail?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken meanings. Abigail's heart pounded as she considered her answer. "I think," she began carefully. "I think I've found a place where I belong. A life that makes me happy. Here," Xavier asked, his voice low. "With cattle and dust and endless work? A woman like you deserves more than this hardscrabble existence." "A woman like me?" Abigail echoed, a hint of challenge in her tone. "And what kind of woman do you think I am, Xavier Reed?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. "The kind who deserves the best of everything. Beauty, comfort, security. A good man who appreciates her worth. And you don't think I can find those things here?" Abigail's voice was barely above a whisper. Xavier's gaze met hers, intense and searching. "I think your brother can offer you a better life in San Francisco than I ever could here." The words stung, all the more because they revealed Xavier had overheard at least part of her conversation with Thomas. But beneath the pain, Abigail recognized something else in Xavier's tone, not indifference, but sacrifice. He was pushing her away because he thought it was best for her, not because he wanted her to go. "Shouldn't that be my decision to make?" she asked quietly. Before Xavier could respond, Thomas's voice called from the barn, asking about more blankets. The moment between them shattered, leaving Abigail with the frustrated sense that something important had almost happened, something that might never happen again. Thomas stayed for 3 days, during which time an uneasy truce seemed to exist between him and Xavier. They were unfailingly polite to each other, but Abigail could sense the tension beneath the surface, two men with fundamentally different worldviews, united only by their concern for her welfare. On the morning of his departure, Thomas took Abigail aside for a final private conversation. "I've arranged everything with the lawyer," he told her. "The divorce proceedings will begin immediately. Given the circumstances, and with my testimony about what I've learned, it should be fairly straightforward." "Thank you," Abigail said sincerely. "I can't tell you what it means to be free of Richard, legally as well as physically." Thomas nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "Abby, I meant what I said about San Francisco. The offer stands. But—" He glanced toward the house, where Xavier was loading Thomas's bags onto the wagon that would take him back to Silver Creek. "I see now that you've found something here. Something or someone worth staying for." Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. "You're not angry?" Thomas smiled ruefully. "How could I be angry about my sister finding happiness? Just promise me one thing: if it doesn't work out with your rancher, you'll come to us. No questions asked, no judgment." "I promise," Abigail whispered, embracing her brother tightly. "Thank you for understanding." After Thomas had gone, the ranch seemed unusually quiet. Xavier busied himself with chores, avoiding the house and Abigail as much as possible. When they did interact, his manner was polite but distant, as if he was already preparing himself for her departure. A week passed in this strange limbo, neither of them addressing the tension that had grown between them. Abigail found herself watching Xavier when he wasn't looking, noting the shadows under his eyes that suggested he was sleeping poorly, the way his gaze would linger on her when he thought she wouldn't notice. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Abigail confronted him one evening as he returned from checking the cattle. "We need to talk," she said firmly, standing in the doorway of the barn as he unsaddled his horse. Xavier's hands stilled momentarily, then resumed their work.
"About what?"
"About whatever it is that's come between us since Thomas arrived," Abigail replied. "About why you've barely spoken 10 words to me in the past week." Xavier sighed, leading his horse into a stall before turning to face her. "I thought you'd be making plans to leave. Your brother made it clear he expects you to join him in San Francisco once your divorce is finalized. And what if I don't want to go to San Francisco?" Abigail challenged. "What if I want to stay here?" "Why would you?" Xavier's voice was rough with emotion. "This is no life for a woman like you, Abigail. Hard work, isolation, none of the comforts or society you deserve." "Stop telling me what I deserve," Abigail said, her patience finally snapping. I know exactly what kind of life I want, Xavier Reed, and it's not in some fine house in San Francisco, no matter how well-intentioned my brother's offer might be. Xavier stared at her, confusion and something like hope warring in his expression. What are you saying? Abigail took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I'm saying that these past months have been the happiest of my life. Not despite the hard work and simplicity, but because of it. Because, for the first time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. She stepped closer to him. And because of you, Abigail. Xavier's voice was a whisper. You saved more than my life that day on the trail, she continued, her heart pounding. You showed me what it means to be truly respected, truly valued. And somewhere along the way, She faltered, suddenly afraid of saying too much, of revealing feelings he might not return. Xavier closed the distance between them, his eyes never leaving hers. You what? He prompted softly. I fell in love with you, Abigail confessed, the words rushing out like water through a broken dam. I know it might seem foolish or too soon after everything that happened with Richard, but I know my own heart, Xavier. And it belongs to you if you want it. For a long moment, Xavier simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, not the reserved smile she was used to, but one of pure, unguarded joy. Want it, he echoed. Abigail, I've been falling in love with you since the moment you opened your eyes in that lined shack. Every day since then has only made me more certain. He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. I never said anything because I thought you deserved better than what I could offer. A better life, a better man. There is no better man, Abigail said fiercely, and no better life than the one we could build together. Xavier's thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, his touch sending shivers through her. Are you sure? Really sure? Because once your divorce is final, if you still feel this way. He took a deep breath. I want to marry you, Abigail. Make a real home with you. Build a future together. Joy burst like sunshine in Abigail's chest. Yes, she whispered. Oh, yes. Xavier's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. I've wanted to do this for so long, he murmured, his face inches from hers. When his lips finally met hers, Abigail felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as months of unspoken longing found expression at last. His arms tightened around her, and she wound her own around his neck, losing herself in the warmth and strength of him. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Abigail Turner, more than I ever thought possible. And I love you, Xavier Reed, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. More than I have words to express. In that moment, standing in the dusty barn with the man she loved, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that the path that had led her here even through abandonment and near death had been the right one all along. The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility, a second chance neither of them had expected, but both now embraced with their whole hearts. 6 months later, on a perfect spring day, Abigail Turner became Abigail Reed in a simple ceremony at the Silver Creek Church. Emma Wilson had insisted on hosting the celebration afterward at the Wilson Ranch, declaring that Xavier and Abigail's first day as husband and wife should be spent enjoying themselves rather than worrying about cooking and cleaning. Thomas had returned from San Francisco for the wedding, bringing his wife Clara and their 2 children to meet Abigail. His wedding gift had been beyond generous, the deed to the adjacent property, effectively doubling the size of Xavier's ranch. For your future, Thomas had said, embracing his sister, and for my nieces and nephews to come. Now, as the celebration wound down, Xavier found Abigail standing alone on the Wilsons' porch, gazing out at the sunset painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Reed, he said softly, coming to stand beside her. Abigail smiled at the sound of her new name. I was just thinking about how life can change so completely in the space of a year, she replied. Last spring, I was heading west with a man who saw me as nothing but a burden. Now I'm here, married to a man who makes me feel treasured every single day. Xavier slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. You are treasured, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. And loved. And respected. And a dozen other things I'll spend the rest of my life showing you. Abigail turned in his embrace, her arms encircling his neck. I think we've put in enough time at this party, don't you? I find myself eager to begin our life together. Properly. Xavier's eyes darkened at her meaning, and he glanced back at the gathering inside. I suppose it is our wedding day. No one could fault us for slipping away early. They said their goodbyes, accepting final congratulations and well wishes before mounting their horses for the ride home. The evening air was sweet with the scent of spring blossoms, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky as they approached the ranch, their home. Xavier had spent weeks before the wedding adding a new wing to the house, surprising Abigail with a larger kitchen, a proper dining room, and a master bedroom with windows that caught the morning sun. It was in this room that he carried her now, crossing the threshold with her in his arms as tradition demanded. Welcome home, Mrs. Reed, he said, setting her gently on her feet. Abigail reached up to touch his face, marveling at the love she saw reflected in his eyes. Home, she repeated softly. I never truly knew what that word meant until you found me, Xavier. We found each other, he corrected, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. And I intend to keep finding you, every day, for the rest of our lives. As the moon rose over the Wyoming territory, casting silver light through the curtains of their bedroom, Abigail and Xavier began their life together as husband and wife. The past, with all its pain and betrayal, receded like a distant shadow, unable to touch the joy they had found in each other's arms. 5 years later, Xavier stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Abigail moved through the garden with their 3-year-old daughter, Sarah, toddling beside her. Their infant son, James, slept peacefully in a cradle nearby, his tiny face the perfect blend of his parents' features. The ranch had prospered beyond Xavier's wildest dreams. The additional land from Thomas had allowed them to increase their herd substantially, and Abigail's garden had evolved into a profitable venture of its own, with her preserves and dried herbs selling briskly in Silver Creek and even being shipped to stores in larger towns. But more than the material success, it was the family they had created together that filled Xavier with pride and gratitude. Every morning he woke beside Abigail. He marveled at the twist of fate that had brought her into his life, a woman left to die on the trail, who had instead found the strength to build a new life filled with love and purpose. Papa, Sarah called, spotting him on the porch. Look what Mama and I found. Xavier descended the steps and crossed to where his daughter stood, holding up a perfect sunflower, nearly as big as her head. That's a beauty, sweetheart, he said, crouching down to her level. Almost as pretty as you and your mama. Abigail smiled at him over their daughter's head, her eyes conveying all the love and contentment she felt. The years had only deepened the bond between them, each challenge faced together, making their foundation stronger. That evening, after the children were asleep, Xavier and Abigail sat together on the porch swing he had built the previous summer. The stars spread across the vast Wyoming sky like diamonds on velvet, and the distant howl of a coyote only emphasized the peaceful security of their home. Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out? Abigail asked, her head resting on Xavier's shoulder. If Richard hadn't left me, if you hadn't found me that day. Xavier's arm tightened around her. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I look at our life, at you, at the children, and I can only be grateful for whatever forces brought us together. He turned to press a kiss to her hair. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, Abby. And being found by you saved me in more ways than one, she replied softly. You didn't just give me a second chance at life, Xavier. You showed me what life could be when shared with the right person. As the night deepened around them, they remained on the porch, talking quietly about their plans for the future, the new barn Xavier wanted to build, the fruit trees Abigail hoped to plant, the education they envisioned for their children. Dreams shaped by love and shared purpose, in a home created through mutual respect and understanding. The trail that had once nearly claimed Abigail's life had led her instead to a love deeper and truer than she had ever imagined possible. In Xavier's arms, she had found not just safety and security, but a partnership of equals, a love that valued her strengths and supported her through weaknesses. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone: a family, a home, a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. And as they finally rose to go inside, hand in hand beneath the star-filled sky, both knew with absolute certainty that this life, this love, this second chance they had given each other was exactly where they were meant to be.